Hi everyone, good afternoon. So welcome back. I hope you had a nice lunch. There was a lot of fish, nice and healthy lunch for the for the scientists. So I'm really happy to be presenting this Women in Science session that we're about to experience together. I see it's pretty popular since we're still looking for more seats. So maybe we'll keep going 1 or 2 minutes until we begin. So scientists and institutions, I've been happy to see in the last few years. I had the chance to interview the chief scientist of Australia, I think it was 3 years ago, who kept on pushing me to please go out and find some black sky and look at the stars, because science and astronomy is a huge thing in Australia. But then I had the opportunity later on to interview the chief scientist in the UK, and it was such great news when Miss Glover came onto the European scene, who is Professor Anne Glover, is the chief advisor to the President of the European Commission on science. And she'll be talking to us today about science for health, but it's been a key driver of mine to see more women in science for the last few years, so it really is a pleasure. So we look forward to the keynote, and let's talk after this. Ms. Glover, please, Professor Glover.
So thank you very much for the welcome and also for the invitation to be here to talk about something which for me is very important, but actually any of us could say this. So one of the most important things for us individually or as societies has to be our health. So looking forward, one of the things that we can harness our science, engineering and technology for is to understand more about our own health, societal health, and how we can deliver this. So I want to use the opportunity then to talk about how we can, if you like, democratize health a little bit more in a global context. And because we're celebrating also women in science, I would just like to point out that it's of great interest if you look historically at where women have had involvement in science, engineering and technology, and particularly in the last few decades. We see a greater and greater increase of women having influence and being able to work particularly in the health area. And I think that's been for the benefit of the whole discipline because it brings a greater diversity approach. I think our challenge is not just to attract that same diversity in all other areas of science and engineering, but as well as attracting women, I think we have the biggest challenge for me is retaining women. And if you ever doubted why that's important, any of you have had any involvement in business will know that if you make a lot of investment in an asset, and you improve that asset so that it's incredibly valuable to you. So from my point of view, this would be a postdoctoral female scientist. And then you're careless enough not to retain that person at that stage in their career. It's like you shoot yourself in the foot. It's utter craziness. And so particularly because we invest so much in the training and the expertise of all scientists, we have to retain the best, men or women. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have ahead of us. But health, where does health come from? So apart from the very healthy lunch that we just had, it's interesting to think in context about how the world changes. And if you think about the 19th century was very much the age of engineering. It was to do with big equipment, steam generation, industrial revolution. So it was very mechanical and very engineering based. And that's not to say that I'm implying that engineering doesn't still have a significant role today. It does, but it now does in partnership with many other disciplines. So for me, 19th century, the age of engineering. 20th century, I think with no doubt, has been the age of chemistry and physics. So we've really started exploring from the very small to the very large. We've started looking inwards at our planet, but looking outwards to our solar system. And using a lot of the technology that we started to develop and think about in the 19th century, we moved on. So really we were talking all about experimentation and being able to understand so much more about the stuff of matter, what makes us what we are. And because I would never fail of talking about it, one of the greatest deliveries really of the 20th century, because the investment was in the 20th century, is looking at the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, where very recently we effectively have understood for the first time, or we've advanced our understanding of the fundamental nature of matter. And why I never get tired of talking about this is that we forget the utterly amazing thing that I'm standing at this lectern and I can hit the lectern with my hand until I die, which I hope will be some long time in the future. My hand never goes through the lectern, but yet the lectern is 99.99% nothing, as is my hand. Yet it never goes through. That mystery we've lived with for so long, but yet now, with the discovery of the Higgs boson, the particle that gives other particles mass, we have some fundamental understanding now of the nature of matter. And you could just think, I need to get out more and find other interesting things to talk about. But just remind, the whole thing about science is if we understand something, then we can potentially use that understanding to deliver all sorts of opportunities. In the case of Large Hadron Collider, who would have thought that in the journey started in the 20th century, that we would go from building accelerators to delivering the Higgs boson, but on the way giving the World Wide Web, using in nuclear medicine, using antimatter in positron emission tomography or PET scanning. Many of you will have had one of these scans. So we never expected that. And that's the beauty of science, is that it's not always necessary to know where you're going or what it is you want to achieve. I would argue it's the same with nuclear fusion. It doesn't much matter. And please don't quote me on this, but it doesn't much matter whether we generate the objective of fusion in 30 years. What we will deliver along the way will be of untold value and wealth for all of us. So this, again, starting in the 19th century and going through to the 20th century. But what about the century that we're in? Well, for me, the 21st century is definitely the age of biology. And some of you could say, well, I would say that because I am a biologist. But I'm sort of glad to be alive now. And I remember very much when I was doing my undergraduate degree, and you tend to look back at what discoveries have been made. And I was thinking about, well, the discovery of the structure of DNA, the discovery of how little nanomachines that we have in each of our cells manufactures proteins and sends them to different locations to give us the sophistication and complexity of the multicellular organism, the human being. And I used to think we've sort of done it all, and I was a bit frustrated. This had been in the 1970s, and I thought, oh, you know, we know everything now. We know DNA, we know how proteins work. Well, obviously that was the inexperience of youth. I could not have been more wrong, because the more we understand about basic biology, the more opportunity it delivers for us in being able to change the way we work with our environment, to look at our own health and how we might live better, but particularly for us in this room, because we're from a developed environment, so that we can age well. So I suppose what would be one of my big ambitions in life, it's to age well and to die well. And I think that those things are actually realistic objectives that we might have. So understanding this whole world of biology gives us massive opportunity and underpins our basic ability to address health in a truly different way than we've been able to do historically. And we can do this not just by focusing on biology, but we do it by working with lots of other areas of science. And for me, this is one of the biggest excitements about science, is that the first papers I published were papers just with me alone. And that's not because nobody wanted to work with me. It's because that's the way it was. People just published on their own or perhaps with a co-author. I mentioned the Large Hadron Collider, and of course it's amazing when you look at the papers published from there, because literally the first page of the publication are the authors, and that must be quite a trial, I think, for some PhD students trying to work out what their contribution was in the whole effort. But I think where, for me, the real excitement of science is going is for me to be a good biologist. And I still have a research lab, although admittedly the output is a lot less than it used to be. Important for me still to have that lab and for me have the credibility of being a working scientist. But I now know that I can't do my job, and I'm interested at the moment in how we respond to stress at the molecular level. Because stress is really interesting. Most of you think stress is a bad thing. I would argue with that, and it depends on your definition of stress. So if I knew that I only had 2 minutes to get from here out to the airport, or I was going to miss the plane, of course I would be I would just give up. But you get the idea. That sort of stress we don't like. But how we respond to stress is a fundamental part of human physiology. And not just that, I can't help being amazed by looking at a simple bacterium and looking at the stress response of that simple form of life and comparing it to the stress response in my cells and seeing so many conservations and evolution of the stress response, indicating to us how important that was for survival of life on our planet. So being able to cope with stress, to work in that, I need to work with bioinformaticians, I work with material scientists, I work with medics, and also medical physicists. I now work with a very broad range of people to be able to deliver valuable science that can be translated from the bench where we do our work to the bedside where it has a real impact on the people that we wish to help. So we use data, and one of my roles, of course, is to take the knowledge that we generate from our experimentation and to try and translate that into improving quality of the policies that we can offer, because that's one of the ways of maximizing the impact of science for the citizen, is making sure that they get the best available science informing policy. If we look at science, health and society, then there are other issues rather than just the science. And I put this up just to mention, and I'm afraid for the people at the back this must be rather faint, but the very large circle, which you can only see part of, the orange bit on the left, these are people dying from hunger and malnutrition. So about 7 million deaths per year. And as I speak to you now, there are probably 2 billion people on the planet who are starving after we've just had our very nice lunch. And a lot of that food and nutrition is important for health. A lot of this is a political issue, because if you look at overall resource on the planet, there is no need for people to be dying of hunger and malnutrition. But compare that with other health issues. HIV, AIDS is the next on the left, then tuberculosis, diabetes, road accidents, just to put it in context, malaria, the small blue one, and then we go into tsunamis and natural disasters where we get cause of death. And I just wanted to illustrate this because in terms of health, a lot of these issues, particularly the four to the left, are all to do with lifestyle, health, and how we deal with it. If we look at health and risk is something that I'm very interested in, I find risk exciting. I find risk is an opportunity. And too often when we hear people talk about risk, it's always a negative connotation of risk. You all took substantial risk in coming here today. Probably you'd be a bit scared by the numbers. It was a risky thing to do. However, most people die in bed, so staying at home in bed would have been quite risky as well. I'm twisting the figures a little bit here, but the thing is, human beings, we are designed with a very good onboard computer that allows us to identify, analyze, quantify risks, and then take the rewards accordingly. And sometimes we forget this. We think that we should live in a risk-free environment. If we were to do that, I think we would all be bored to death. So we really need to embrace this idea of risk. And particularly for me, risk averseness is undermining our ability to provide new healthcare options, to provide new opportunities for society, to underpin innovation, particularly in Europe, but beyond. And we must get away from the idea that we focus on hazard. Assessing things according to hazard has really no value. It should only be risk, because hazard times exposure gives us our risk. Hazard alone is meaningless. So just to have a look at some actual hazards on the bottom, but how people think about them. Most people are very concerned about terrorist attacks in terms of feeling it's a great high risk. But just look at the bottom there, that little orange blob. That's the actual incidence, very low, but yet it changes entire behaviours and lifestyles. It's more complicated than I'm saying, but I think that we really need to capture the opportunity. We must be able to assess and embrace risk. So how do we get smart health for a smart society? And there's a lot of smartness on this slide, but we do need to think about interactions and collaborations much more. So one of the things that I enjoy doing within the European Commission is to get people who've perhaps think they have no role in health, such as people who work in transport, for example, or energy, and to get them to see how their policies, in working with other people, can deliver something rather different when it comes to our health, particularly also the digital environment and digital economy, delivering us much more ability to have information and act upon it, but to monitor and to be able to do things in a different way that is consistent with our 21st century thinking. We also need to think about where our health is badly affected by natural disasters, and I mentioned that to you earlier. And these natural disasters, I'd have to say, are becoming more and more frequent. And although we should never mix up weather with climate, we are seeing an enhanced frequency of very serious events, such as floodings, forest fires, and so on. And I think that to be able to preserve health against this background is an enormous challenge for us, both in terms of policy making, but just a societal challenge for the 21st century. We can't really think anymore of health in the context of just me, where I live, in my town, my city, my country. We have to think of health in a global context, because each one of us, more so now than ever before, each one of us is a global citizen. And I know that it's an easy thing to say, global citizen, and we perhaps like the idea, but it brings with it substantial responsibility, because it does mean that you can't just think of you here. You have to think of the other people who are sharing the planet with you. And so we have a number of outbreaks, chikungunya here, West Nile virus, but at the moment we're also looking at bird flu and novel coronavirus as potentially global threats in terms of health. And why it's so important is because we all travel and we go places and we take with us our, and I love to say this because I'm a microbiologist, so my body, there are, let's just make it a round number, there are about 10 times more microbial cells in my body than there are human cells. So really, this is a microbe addressing you today, or a microbial community. The human form, I'm just carrying all these microbes around. There's many more of them than there are of me, the human. And because of that, they are crucial to our health. But when things go wrong, then of course we see big disasters. So we need to be able to work globally to share science information and advice. And also, one of the things important for me, building up a network of chief scientific advisors, not just in the European Union, but having a global network. So we might talk about things from the point of view of evidence, and that, I hope, would de-risk things to allow politicians to be able to act more easily, on our evidence. So, moving on, health. Health very much is affected by environment, and I've alluded also to climate change. So we need to look at historical data. We can do this very well to understand how environment has shaped our health, and also how future challenges, particularly around climate change, might bring us to be seeing infectious diseases here on the European continent, which we would never have dreamed of seeing in previous decades. And we already see this with warming or the lack of insect vectors for many disease being killed out by cold winters. So we have a lot of evidence that we can draw from, and I would just like to point out that someone like me is lucky because, as well as being a global citizen, that also means I'm a global scientist, and we can rely on the network of scientists globally to be able to provide the best possible advice. And I mention EASAC, the European Academy's Science Advisory Council, who can bring together that expertise from learned academies across Europe and really help to inform how we might make big changes when it comes to policy for health in particular. I wanted to mention, I was talking about this collaboration in health, and information communication technology has undergone somewhat, for me, of a revolution in terms of informing health and also in terms of what we might be able to do, because it allows us to share data and information about health. So this is a lot about crowd stuff, but we can use the fact that many of us are involved with social media. We can data mine what people are searching for on the web, and that can give us a lot of information about health, such as really informative prediction about flu outbreaks. So many of you will know by analysing who is searching for remedies for sore head, aching bones, tiredness on the web. That tells you when a flu epidemic is about to happen. It happens before people go to their doctors to say, I'm not feeling so well. So we can use an awful lot of what we do and how we interact to inform what we do with our health. And I thought I would also just mention this because here we have in this an outline here of in Japan, where we had the problem with the tsunami and then issues with Fukushima. Well, what we can do is we have sensors, because human beings are sensors. So we can use, if you like, the data that can be generated by individuals, and we can gather that data and we can use it to inform activity, something we could only have dreamed about previously. Because even in big disasters, mobile phone networks still work, and we can communicate and provide meaningful data with which we can do things. So in terms of fact or fiction, I remember once I did a very nice event in the European Parliament, and it was essentially we were celebrating space, and which is a very inspirational research area to work in. But we started thinking it was also involved a lot of Star Trek stuff, and I have to admit And maybe here I should get out more, but I really like Star Trek. But that's just, maybe it's my age. But a lot of the fiction in Star Trek, so something that was 1960s, has now been translated into needleless injection, body sensor technology, scanning. I mentioned positron emission tomography earlier on, but MRI scanning, CAT scanning, all of these non-invasive technologies which can allow us to diagnose and really deliver innovation for health and medicine. So health in the future then. I mentioned about our world population. And if we look moving forward to 2050, then the world population will probably increase by another 2 billion, mostly in Asia and Africa. The number of cars will have doubled, reaching about 2 billion. And that won't be one each, as you can imagine. 70% of people will live in cities. There's an enormous challenge for public health in that urbanization of our population. The number of people over 80 will have increased substantially. That will be me, will be one of them. And we'll have reached a number that really does dictate to us that we have to find new ways of growing older better. And indeed, there will also be over 150 million climate refugees. We must never forget this, because I know I come from Scotland, and a lot of people in Scotland say climate change. This will be great for us. It's possible the temperature could burst through the 20 degrees centigrade level. But in fact, although there might be a hope that that would happen, what we forget is that it also means that some whole countries, 150 million, well, Bangladesh is 155 million people, and it's almost below sea level now. So with any significant level, sea level rise, 155 million people need to go somewhere else. These are big challenges for us in health. We need to talk about health more. I said it's one of the most important things that we can deliver, and I believe that. And we need to harness all the knowledge that we have to be able to get the best options for health as I said earlier, for the global citizen. We need to think about how we communicate, and we need to do that much better as scientists. So that, here's just an example here from a comic produced by the European Commission in collaboration with the European Space Agency, led by one of my colleagues, Didier Schmidt, who is currently working in my team. And what this was about is trying to get young people to understand how important space is in delivering meaningful changes for everyday life. And this is just a health example, because a lot of this, being able to communicate from a distance, to be somewhere virtually that you're not in reality, all of this is delivered by space research that we would not necessarily have thought would be revolutionary for health. But it is. Even things such as bones mending. We have learnt so much about what happens to the human physiology in space. We can bring that back to Earth and deliver. And actually, there is also a bit of serendipity here. Just in this research, somebody was telling me when they were looking at trying to increase the repair rate of fractures, they said that you get a lot of young men who get double arm fractures from motorbike accidents. So they break both their arms, and they're always put in plaster, and they're told not to ride their motorbikes. But these are young men, so they're not so sensible. Apologies here for the men in the audience. And an awful lot of these young men go out, and they ride their bike with 2 plasters on their hand, and they come back to the clinic. Now here's the amazing thing. Their fractures heal quicker than the sensible young men who just stay at home and read books and don't go on the bike, because the vibration on the bike had a real impact in being able to stimulate fracture repair. So that was done partly with ESA. I don't recommend it, but there's a bit of serendipity in science as well. Communication is absolutely central. I'm running out of time, so I don't want to go through this, but if you don't talk about science in a meaningful way to citizens with no background in science, no understanding of how research, makes a big difference when it comes to healthcare and how their life has been transformed by modern healthcare, then it's no wonder that they don't want to support budget going to science. And it's no wonder that politicians don't stand up and say, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure we get an increase in the science budget. It's the most important thing that we can do for our citizens. It's certainly one of the most important things. To allow them to do that, we have to communicate better. And just the third bullet point, we also need to show empathy, because scientists, I think many of us, we can't help it. There's an arrogance. You think, well, I know all this stuff, and therefore I know what is good for people, and so on. We don't know what's good for people. We just generate knowledge as scientists. But what we could do better is we could talk about it in a way that was immediate, it was engaging, that it didn't have jargon, because it is possible to do that. And I think we really need to do that. And the last point, if we see science being misused or misquoted, it's not someone else's job to put that journalist right, or that politician right, or the policy maker, or the citizen, whoever. It's the scientist's job to put it right. We have the knowledge, we need to share it. So, what else do we need? Last thing, we do need smart citizens, and we want citizens to be demanding. So there's been a little bit of a disconnect in health research and other areas where I think we as scientists think we know what the best thing to research in. And we know a lot of interesting stuff that we could do. But we should ask citizens more. What do they want to see? What healthcare is important to them? Where would they like to see the big difference? And in every area of science, not in health, we need to do that. We need scientists who can generate the knowledge. We need industry to start transforming that knowledge into meaningful impact for the citizen. And we also need smart politicians who regulate to allow us to develop an innovative society and to provide a level playing field. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm very happy to answer any questions. Thank you.